atonement theory, for those that may be a little bit confused, references what happened when Jesus died on the cross. Atonement, at-one-ment, something shifted within the relationship of God and everything and everyone through the crucifixion. So what exactly happened on the cross? So that's what atonement theories are trying to answer. Okay, look, this is what we're going with. We got S tier is like super tier, top notch. I'm gonna put some atonement theories here that are like undeniable. We cannot deny it. We gotta all agree. Christians, at least they should. And if they don't agree, then they need to reread their Bible. That's S tier. A is like, there's some pretty good arguments against it. It's usually pretty dang helpful, but it doesn't work for everybody. B is, yeah, it's been helpful for some, not helpful for others. The amount of helpfulness kind of outweighs the unhelpfulness just a little bit. C, yeah, usually unhelpful, not that great.
F.
That's how we're going to rate these. I want to go in chronological order, by the way. Not in chronological order based on when people thought of these things, but rather when people decided to clearly, explicitly flesh them out into a specific theory of the atonement. Let's start with, just get this out of the way. Let's start with Gnosis. Gnosis gets the first F tier. It's not popular at all because the Gnostic movement, which was kind of a fringe group of heretics that were immediately stamped out by the early Christians, yeah, they're not popular. They got stamped out. That nobody's really a Gnostic these days. But early Christianity, these groups arose that claimed the spiritual is good and the material is evil, hyper-dualistic. And they believed that a lesser god or a demiurge created the universe and that Jesus came from this higher god who sent Jesus, and they often called this higher god the good. And this Jesus came to show us how to escape the material world through Gnosis, or knowledge. So Jesus tries to get people to be enlightened through this divine secret knowledge that helps us kind of escape the material world while we're here. And then after some time, when you die, that's ultimate liberation. And so Jesus on the cross is liberated from the world. And that's what salvation is, escaping the material world. I hate that because I feel like any theory of the crucifixion should emphasize God's embrace of the material world, because every other major unique Christian claim depicts a God embracing the material world, and that's what makes it Christian. Embracing the human, embracing the earth, embracing the bodies. And so this whole idea that no, this is all evil and we need to escape from it, I think is very dangerous. This idea that the spiritual is better than the material still lives on as a kind of a poison within the Christian church. You know me, I'm not one to like claim, oh, that's heresy, get rid of it because they said it's heresy. I got a soft spot for heretics, but this one, it's like, I get it. All right, next, ransom. Ransom was mostly popular from the 4th to 11th centuries. You may hear glimpses of it. Like I say ransom, this theory mostly comes from Origen, early church father. And it says, when Adam and Eve sinned in Eden, they sold humanity over to the devil. So humanity belonged to the devil, and the devil demanded to be paid a ransom to free us. So God owed the devil a ransom, and the only ransom big enough was Jesus' death on the cross. So through the crucifixion, the ransom was paid, and the devil freed us and gave us back to God. Theologians had, of course, a ton of criticisms for this because it could make the mistake of painting God and the devil as two equal warring gods. And it may sound like it's maximizing the power of the devil in this theory, but a lot of them saw it as minimizing the power of God. That's like one of the biggest motivating factors for getting theologians to kick their butt into gear. Somebody's minimizing the power of God. Somebody's saying that God isn't as powerful as all powerful. Someone grab me a quill. So it makes sense why this specific ransom, exactly how I said it, kind of fell out of popularity. There's a bit of evolution to the theory, and we'll get to that. But it also makes sense because it's kind of weak from the start. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests that the devil owned humanity. I would say C. I think it's kind of weak. But next, Christus Victor, Christ the Victor. That name specifically comes from a book from 1931 from the theologian Gustav Aulin. But the model for this atonement theory is way, way older. It goes way back to the early church fathers. But in this book from 1931, Aulin argued that it's been greatly exaggerated that the early church believed in ransom in the way that I just described it. And he said that most of the early church fathers actually believe something closer to this theory. And he's correct. You can find plenty of examples of kind of hints at a kind of Christus Victor theory, but it seems it developed around the same time as ransom, and then as ransom fell out of popularity, Christus Victor has stood the test of time, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And you can still hear all about Christus Victor in Eastern Orthodox churches all the time. Maybe a couple years ago, I would have been more dismissive of Christus Victor, but after hearing Eastern Orthodox Christians talk about it, I get it. And it still says Adam and Eve sold humanity to the devil, but God didn't have to pay a ransom to the devil. God defeated the devil through the crucifixion, and Christ rises triumphant as the victor. Christus Victor. People are saying B. I think maybe A. Let's say A for now. The reason I don't put this at S is because I feel like it still operates on this idea that humanity belong to Satan somehow, which doesn't seem to be in the Bible, but it kind of takes that idea and just makes it better than what it was. And I do like this idea of defeating Satan, defeating death, defeating evil. But then, of course, the next question is, then how come there still is death and evil and sin? And the answer would then become eschatological. It would become about where history is headed. That means you need more theories attached to this one. So I feel like because people could argue against it, I'm going to put it at A. Let's keep going. Satisfaction. Just kidding. So satisfaction was developed around the 12th century by the theologian Anselm, and he was trying to correct some of the problems of ransom theory because he didn't like this idea of like God owing anything to the devil. It's like, what? God owed something to the devil and then he satisfied the devil with payment? If anyone's owed anything, it should be God. And if anyone is satisfied, it should be God. So he gets rid of the devil out of his atonement theory. And he says, God is owed our honor. God is deserving of honor. But our disobedience continuously dishonors God. And so we've racked up this debt of dishonor toward God who is deserving of honor. And so we're the ones, humans, owe God this debt of honor. So humanity's disobedience dissatisfies God. And then Jesus' surplus of obedience through death on the cross satisfies God. That's why this is called satisfaction. You may start to think that this is kind of referencing punishment. There's no punishment in this theory. That comes in later theories. But just for the basic satisfaction theory, there's no punishment. It's just we owe a debt of honor to God. And it's not that God's going to punish anybody because somebody didn't pay the debt. It's just somebody needs to pay it eventually, basically, but nobody's going to get punished for it. And so, yeah, this one's a little sus. Moral influence is next. So moral influence was developed not that long later after satisfaction in the 12th century by Peter Abelard as kind of a reaction to the satisfaction model. Abelard rejected ransom theory and rejected satisfaction because, first off, he had the same problem. He didn't like anybody minimizing the power of God, and he felt like Anselm's theory of satisfaction still made the same mistake. And so he didn't like that in Anselm's model, it seemed like God felt one way toward humanity, and then after the crucifixion, he felt another way toward humanity. And Abelard felt like that was a threat to the theological concept of the immutability of God, or the unchanging nature of God. He felt like, we need a God that doesn't change. I don't like this idea of God changing his mind through the crucifixion. So Abelard said what the crucifixion actually was God demonstrating God's love for the world through the crucifixion. So the crucifixion is like not to change the mind of God, but to change the mind of humans. And so the crucifixion is like this divine magnet of love that softens the hearts of all sinners and gets them to repent and turn to God, because they are so overtaken by the love of God that they want to respond with love in return. And so Peter Abelard was condemned and excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Of course he was. Honestly, I feel like moral influence is like maybe a bit too reactive. It's kind of in the Bible, but I have a soft spot for heretics, so I'll put it in A. Good job, Peter Abelard. I feel like I was raised on a mixture of a bunch of these. That's important. As we'll get through this, you'll start to really feel that more and more, because truthfully, we need multiple models to understand the mystery of the crucifixion. Next,
Penal substitution.
I'm just going to give it an automatic F and explain it. Penal substitution says Jesus was punished in our place, or rather, Jesus was penalized as a substitution for us. That's why it's penal substitution. It's an evolution of the satisfaction model, except it says that Jesus takes the punishment for all of humanity. It brings in punishment to this model that says there was a debt of honor owed to God, and then Jesus paid it. It brings punishment into that because it was formulated by lawyers. John Calvin, a trained lawyer, reinterpreted Anselm's satisfaction model through the lens of the terminology of the criminal law court. It actually gets worse than penal substitution, so we'll get there. But yeah, so in this model, through this lens of the court, God is the judge in front of the court, and humanity is on trial, and humanity is guilty. And the only appropriate punishment is the death penalty. But it's God, so it's eternal damnation. And then, all of a sudden, Jesus bursts through the doors of the courthouse and says, "Wait, no, take me instead." And then God says,
"Deal."
By the way, what I'm saying right now has been preached at so many youth camps and kids' churches, and they think it's a great analogy. It says Jesus takes the punishment for all humanity. God punishes Jesus. God tortures Jesus, damns Jesus, gives Jesus the full weight of the wrath that was meant for all of humanity. And Jesus takes it all. I don't see that in the Bible at all. Yes, there are parts of the Bible that refer to Jesus' death as a sacrifice. And a lot of people who support penal substitution like to say that it's all over the Bible. This symbol of substitutionary atonement, substitutionary sacrifice, that someone deserves a punishment, but then God steps in. And they're correct that this symbol of substitutionary sacrifice is throughout the Bible and throughout history, but not in this way. In fact, you could find stories of substitutionary sacrifice like even before Christianity, like in Greece. Y'all know where my name comes from? Damon. I believe it comes from a Greek story of two friends named Damon and Pythias. And Pythias is in trouble with the king or something, but he's gonna get executed. But he says, "I want to go back home and set all my affairs in order and say bye to my family one last time." And of course, they don't want to let him go because he could just run away. And then his best friend Damon says, "I'll sit here in your place and wait for you to come back. And if my friend does not come back, then you could execute me instead." And they're like, "All right, deal." And Pythias leaves. Damon sits there and waits, ready to die for his friend. And Pythias returns. And then the king is so shocked that he actually came back. He had a chance to get away, and he actually came back to protect his friend. And he was just like so moved by the loyalty between these two friends that he like just let them both go. I think maybe in some versions of the story too, he was like, "I want to be your friend." I don't know, something like that. That's where my name comes from. It's like, that's substitutionary sacrifice. That is just like what love looks like. To take that and say that that backs up penal substitution theory, because we see substitutionary sacrifice all over the Bible and all over history, is Dangerously incorrect. Okay, next. Moral exemplar. Moral exemplar, I would say, has definitely always been within Christianity, but it was explicitly fleshed out as a like condensed theory in the 1500s, mostly by the theologian Faustus Socinus, I think is how you say his name, or Socinus. It rejected satisfaction theory and penal substitution theory. And it's similar to moral influence theory. Moral exemplar theory is similar to moral influence theory. They both say that the crucifixion wasn't trying to change God's mind, it was trying to change humans' minds. But the moral exemplar teaches that Jesus' death was part of Jesus trying to show us how to live. Out of all the atonement theories, this one focuses way more on the life of Jesus than the death of Jesus. It doesn't say Jesus came to die for anything. It says Jesus came to show us how to live through the way that he lived in the world. His death was a natural consequence to living this radical of a life. Jesus' commitment to this kind of life that lasts all the way until his death is the message we're supposed to get out of his death. We are called to pick up our own cross and follow Jesus. So even though this was like explicitly laid out in the 1500s, I believe that this one was believed by even Jesus' disciples and the early church and onward. I put this at S tier because I don't think anyone could deny this. The disciples and the early Christians understood we are called to pick up our own cross and live like Jesus, and this is going to lead to our death just like it led to Jesus' death. And that's what it means to be a Christian. Any criticisms for moral exemplar only have any bearing if they begin with, okay, we agree this is true, which you just explained, and we also believe that there's more meaning to the crucifixion, not just moral exemplar. Yes, that's there, but we also believe there's more, and we think maybe it's a little irresponsible to just stop there. That's the only criticism that has any bearing. But any criticism that says this is not communicated through the crucifixion or this is not biblical are just silly. This is undeniable. This is within the meaning, whether you believe that there's more meaning or not. Governmental is next.
This is the worst one.
It is the evolution of penal substitution theory. It is largely what is preached when people describe penal substitution theory. It's kind of a fix to penal substitution to make sure that everything is consistent. And so the problem with penal substitution is that if you take it to its logical conclusion, saying that God was going to punish all of humanity, but then Jesus took all of that punishment, the only logical conclusion to that when it comes to the afterlife is universalism. That's the logical conclusion of that theory. But the Protestant theologians got to keep their hell and keep threatening with it. And so they realize, all right, let's make some changes here. And so in come governmental theory in the 1600s, which says that God is the moral governor of the universe, based mostly on ideas from Hugo Grotius, theologian and lawyer. Everything gets ruined when we put theology in the hands of lawyers. I'm telling you. And so he says, God did give Jesus all that punishment, but it didn't satisfy God's wrath. God is still not satisfied. And God punishing Jesus was simply a demonstration on the world stage of God's displeasure with sin. So he shows the world, this is what my wrath looks like for the disobedient. Substitution is now explicitly conditional. Jesus was punished not for the sins of humanity, but for the sins of obedient Christians. Everyone else still gets eternally damned. And it sounds obviously like a horror story. It is. But some pastors who preach this would argue it's still good news because it's your choice to be an obedient Christian. If you want to be one of the ones that Jesus died for, just be an obedient Christian. And if you choose not to, then it's your own fault because you knew the consequences were eternal damnation. It's very manipulative and not biblical. And it's just this evolution of atonement theory manipulated by lawyers. And it's disgusting, evil even. It's extremely prevalent, so prevalent that I know a lot of people have completely walked away from Christianity. Or if you were to ask them what is Christianity, what does Christianity teach, they would describe what I just said. And if you were to say, actually, no, that theory of what Jesus did on the cross is only a few centuries old. The majority of Christian history, Christians did not believe this way, and there's always been plenty of Christians that don't actually believe this. But it is so prevalent that in some of those conversations, that person may think you're like gaslighting them. And it's difficult because of the trauma that the church has caused in so many people's lives, largely because of this awful theology. It's difficult to get them to understand that there's actually other ways of talking about this stuff. This isn't actually the only way. This just happens to be the theory of atonement that was adopted by evangelicals, and evangelicals have spent the last century trying to dominate the world. I wish this could be like F minus 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 tier. Okay, now this is all of the atonement theories that are centuries years old. Now we're going to get to the atonement theories that have been developed within the last century. And you may initially want to like dismiss those because they're not like historic, but I would argue, first off, a lot of these atonement theories were just too reactive. They were just looking at a popular atonement theory at the time and just wanting to go the other direction and just flippantly writing it out and being like, we gotta preach this now in order to get rid of that one. But in the 20th century, with all this access to knowledge and being able to read up all of these writings and have a better historical view, they were able to like take their time and contemplate a bit and try to develop theories that maybe are a bit better, more truthful to history, more truthful to the Bible. So we should consider some of the atonement theories that have arisen within the last century. First, the last scapegoat. The last scapegoat is very new atonement theory developed in the mid to late 20th century from the work of anthropologist René Girard. He's done like a lot of work developing his theory on mimetic theory. Mimetic theory says that desire in humans is based on imitation. Desire is birthed from wanting what others have, and that mimetic desire leads to violence. So as humanity grew, this violence rooted in mimetic desire grew across civilizations. And over time, as this violence would build up, they developed scapegoating in order to release this valve of growing violence. And so they would pick a victim, and to relieve the pressure of society's guilt, they would pile all the guilt, all the shame, all the sin, all the blame onto this victim or group of victims and say we have to eliminate them in order to eliminate our problems. And so we haven't even got to the atonement part yet. Of course, as you continue scapegoating, there's always a new scapegoat. You eliminate your scapegoat, and then, of course, you move on to blaming someone else or blaming another group of people. It just continues. So for this atonement theory is also saying the crucifixion didn't change God's mind. This is to change humans' minds. And it says that God recognizes humanity's problem with violence and their error of trying to solve their problem through scapegoating. And so God sends Jesus as the last scapegoat. So Jesus is killed by the violent crowd, but then Jesus is revealed to be blameless as the perfect innocent Son of God, which then exposes the crowd as guilty for their own violence that they're trying to put on others through scapegoating. And so it is through scapegoating this obviously blameless victim, Jesus, that the cycle of scapegoating is exposed, and we're faced with the opportunity to overcome our violence. I like this. That's pretty true and hard to deny. It's pretty fringe though, for sure. But I also feel like I think I'll always favor the theories that say that the crucifixion was to change humans' minds, not God's mind. I think this is one of the best ones. I was trying to go back and forth between S or A. I'll say A. Academy, the theological equivalent is making your kids smoke the whole pack. For that comment, we're going to B. Let's move on. Solidarity. Now, I'm kind of combining some of these atonement theories and just putting them under the category of solidarity because there's a few atonement theories that pretty much all say this, that the crucifixion was God's way of expressing solidarity with the suffering of the world. And there's a bunch of different people who said this from different angles. And like theologian Jürgen Moltmann took the Holocaust very seriously in his theology. So he tried to write about suffering in a more complex way. He talked about the crucifixion in this way. And he talked about the God-forsakenness experienced by the suffering of the world, and how Jesus on the cross cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's the experience of all people who are suffering in the world. No God in heaven to come down and save them, experiencing an absolute God-forsakenness. And Jesus, or through Jesus, God experiences that too. And you even have it in a lot of liberation theologies. John Sobrino in El Salvador referred to people who suffer in the underdeveloped world as the crucified peoples of the world. And then you got James Cone, who wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, who said that the crucifixion was a first century lynching. And so the cross is a symbol for the suffering of the world, but an opportunity to overcome our suffering, to achieve victory over our suffering, because you can proclaim that you can kill the body, but you can't kill the spirit, making a way out of no way. The spirit lives on among the people who continue the fight for liberation. I think that's pretty cool. It's like God suffers with us. I don't put it at S. I like it. Next, this one's even more fringe, perhaps the most fringe. That's the crucifixion as the death of God. Also, in response to the fact that suffering people don't have a God in heaven who's going to come down and save them. It takes inspiration from philosophers who claim that God is dead. And it takes those claims seriously. And the primary advocate for death of God theology was Thomas Altizer. He takes Philippians 2 just very seriously. Philippians 2 says how Christ emptied himself, becoming nothing, and humbled himself by dying on the cross. And so Altizer takes that as a reflection for what God does, that God emptied God's self into Jesus and died as Jesus. But instead of going backward after that and just becoming all powerful again, Altizer says the self-emptying already happened. You can't go backward. The only choice is to continue going forward by fully incarnating into the world. So it is the death of transcendence, of the transcendent otherworldly being somewhere else. It is the death of transcendence in the spirit of immanence, and increasing in immanence more and more and more in closeness throughout this everlasting process of self-emptying. Similar to other theories, this theory encourages us to take responsibility, realize there is no transcendent God that is going to come down and save us. So we are called to realize that we must act as the body of God in the world, or as the body of Christ. I feel like it's a poetic reimagining that's very helpful for those who have gone just completely through nihilism. This presentation of the crucifixion, I think, is able to be grasped in that point of life, where it's like, yes, I've experienced nihilism. I'm born in it, molded by it. There is nothing. There's no other realm, no other beings out there. But this idea of embracing that truth, that there is nothing else out there, but we're called to embody God in the world, is powerful. Yeah, it's for the Christian atheists. We're gonna put it at B. It's not really helpful for everybody, but there is a good amount of people that it is helpful for. It's very helpful for me in my personal exploration of my religion and spirituality. I don't talk about it much. It's kind of esoteric and difficult to explain, and I want to be more practical with stuff. Last one, everybody. Historical consequence. Now, this theory arises from various feminist theologians and womanist theologians who do theology from the perspective of black women, not just women in general or white women. And so they looked at these atonement theories, specifically the really popular ones, and were like, all these are just formulated by men who were finding a way to justify violence by filling it with divine meaning. And a lot of them had experienced violence by the hand of men who try to justify it with divine meaning. And so they viewed atonement theories in general, all atonement theories, as an attempt to justify violence. Any attempt of claiming that there's meaning in the crucifixion is an attempt to justify violence. And so they felt like the only responsible response to the crucifixion is to recognize it as unjustified, meaningless, and unnecessary violence, just like most violence experienced by marginalized people. And so it is through proclaiming that the violence Jesus suffered as unnecessary that we can continue proclaiming that the violence faced by all marginalized people is unnecessary and cannot be justified by the privileged and powerful. I like this one. I'm gonna put an S. Because even though it kind of like if you affirm this, you kind of then have to say you can kind of have to reject all of these if you affirm this one. But how I view it is I affirm historical consequence, and then because I affirm historical consequence, I hold any other good atonement theory or beautiful atonement theory loosely. I hold it very loosely. This is kind of like the foundation for me, the historical consequence, and then any other I acknowledge are constructions by humans. Ultimately, the crucifixion and what happened on the cross is a divine mystery, and it very much short circuits our meaning making systems in our brain. You can't just easily say, oh, it means that. Oh, that was God doing this or that. It short circuits that part of our brains. It's supposed to disturb and disrupt us. We still are meaning making creatures, and so we come up with all kinds of atonement theories, but it's good to learn how to hold them loosely and acknowledge that we need multiple. We can't just pick one. This is complex. We can't have one theory that explains everything. So let's have a few cool ones and just bounce back and forth with them. That's what we all do already. This is my tier list.